Hello, and welcome to Dornsife School of Public Health's 2020 Public Health Immersion program. My name is Caroline Voiles, and I'm the Director of Student Placement and Partnership Development at Dornsife. I'm joined by Jordan Wood, the Practice Office Assistant and an undergraduate senior. Today, you'll hear from some of our faculty and alumni about how they apply public health research and practice in contributing to the well-being of local, regional, and global communities. Additionally, this module will feature examples how Dornsife students have the opportunity to apply classroom teaching towards making a difference in the world of public health.
Welcome to Module 5, Violence. In this module, you'll hear from faculty member Dr. Lonnie Tabb and MPH alum Kenna Yadeta about their work to examine and address negative health caused by violence.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are as you're viewing this presentation. Welcome to the 2020 Immersion program at the Dornsife School of Public Health. My name is Dr. Lonnie Phillip Tabb, and I am currently an associate professor of biostatistics in the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics. And today I wanted to give a presentation about some of the work that I've been engaged with over the past few years while here at Drexel. And so what I'll do now is I will share my screen so that you can see my slides. And the title of the talk is Public Health Ways in Reconsidering Alcohol Outlets, the Built Environment as a Potential Driver of Crime. And so a brief overview, I'd like to just discuss a little bit about this relationship between alcohol and violence in cities. And I'll talk about the design of the study, because in order for us to actually examine such complex relationships, you have to design a study so that it will allow you to do such an examination. And there were two studies in particular that I will be presenting today, one that is Philadelphia-based, and the second study is Seattle-based. And so you'll soon understand why there is a connection between these two cities. And then I'll end with some concluding remarks that I often like to term, now what? What do we do with these research findings? So just to give you a bit of background about this really complicated relationship between alcohol and violence. So alcohol-related violence is a serious public health concern. Yes, here in the United States, but also globally. And unfortunately, higher alcohol outlet density, which means basically increased access to alcohol and availability, they are associated with negative social outcomes. And while there are a ton of social outcomes that one could consider, my focus is on violence. And with violence, when you think about it at the neighborhood level, violence in neighboring neighborhoods, so contiguous neighborhoods, they're potentially correlated. And when we say correlated, we basically are giving a head nod to the fact that alcohol availability, especially if we're looking at this relationship between alcohol and violence, it can spread from neighborhood to neighborhood. Think about you and think about how you move about in your life. There are times where you purchase things, could be alcohol related things in your own neighborhood, but that also could mean that you go to the neighborhood next door, or you go to a neighborhood, honestly, that might just be more convenient to you, and maybe it's near your work or your employer. And so the thing about alcohol and violence is that it spreads, it's fluid, and it's not stagnant. And then when we further think about alcohol and violence, there is this notion that if you increase the amount of alcohol availability, then you will increase the related alcohol issues, okay? And so privatization means that it will then remove state control on alcohol sales and distribution. And what privatization does is that it increases the presence of alcohol outlets in certain regions. And so there still are a certain number of states where the state controls all of the alcohol sales and all of the alcohol distribution. And unfortunately, when privatization happens and it moves away from state control, the effect has been shown to actually alter this relationship between alcohol outlets and these various alcohol-related issues like violence. And so the motivation behind some of the studies that I'm going to be talking about is that we have about 17 states that still own the liquor stores in that state. And they control the sale, they control the distribution, they control even the timing of when these stores are open and close. And Pennsylvania is one of them. And so that's why Philadelphia is of interest to me, not only because I am from the city of Philadelphia, but because that's where we sit. That's where Drexel University sits. And then Washington State, the Supreme Court passed an initiative called Initiative 1183 back in 2011. So people came out and they voted, and what this initiative entailed was to privatize liquor sales. So Washington State was one of those states where the state controlled all of the alcohol sales and distribution. But after passing this law, it privatized liquor sales and distribution in 2012. So Washington now becomes a fully privatized state, which then means you're going to see an increase in alcohol sales and distribution. And so let's talk about the design of the two studies that I'll introduce. So when we talk about design, I have to first grapple with, well, how do I, if I'm really interested in looking at this relationship between alcohol and violence, how do I obtain the violence data? How do I obtain the alcohol data? So the violence data I'm able to obtain from police departments. So the Philadelphia Police Department, the Seattle Police Department. And the nice thing about this data is that it will tell me the type of violence that is occurring and the location. So the location is key because I need to know where, right? And so the latitude and longitude allows me to actually pinpoint where on a map, say in the city of Philadelphia, or where on a map in the city of Seattle, the violent act occurred. And then the type is important because aggravated assaults are different from simple assaults. Aggravated assaults are attempts to cause severe bodily injury, and oftentimes it involves a weapon, whereas though the simple assaults, not so much. Now that's the violence data. The alcohol data is obtained from control boards. Every state in the United States has a control board. So if I want Philadelphia-based data, I need to go to the Pennsylvania Liquor Control Board. So that's what I did for data in the year 2010. If I want information or data for the city of Seattle, I need to go to the Washington State Liquor Control Board. And I obtained that for 2010 through 2013. And the reason why is because I was interested in looking at what happened before versus after privatization in the entire state. Now, keep in mind that in Washington State, not only did they privatize liquor sales and distribution, but they also legalized marijuana around that time. So now that control board is actually called Washington State Liquor and Cannabis Board. So their acronym actually did not change from before, legalizing marijuana to after now legalizing marijuana. So the nice thing about this alcohol data is that, again, I'm able to have the address. So the address tells me where the alcohol outlet or the alcohol license exists, and then it tells me the type. And so there are two main types of alcohol outlets. There are those called off-premise alcohol outlets, and these are those alcohol outlets such as grocery stores, wine and spirits shops, etc. And then the second major type is on-premise. And so you might be more familiar with these because these are the restaurants, the bars, the clubs, and taverns. So the first study that I published that was Philadelphia-based was published back in 2013. And this paper was entitled Alcohol Outlet Density and Violence, the Role of Risky Retailers and Alcohol-Related Expenditures. So not only was I interested there in looking at this relationship between alcohol outlets and violence, I wanted to see if that relationship, that positive relationship, and when I say positive, meaning the more alcohol outlets you have in a neighborhood, the more violence that's occurring in that same neighborhood. So positive in that sense. I wanted to see if that relationship still held true even after controlling for other neighborhood level things like risky retailers. And when I say risky retailers, I'm talking about retailers like pawn shops and check cashing facilities. And then alcohol expenditures, because you want to control in some sense, how much are people actually spending on alcohol in these neighborhoods? And so the aims of this study were to characterize and map the distribution of alcohol outlets and violence in Philadelphia during that year of 2010. And then the second goal was to examine the association between alcohol outlets and violence. But then, as I mentioned, I wanted to control and consider alcohol expenditures, so that's cost, and then presence of these other types of retailers, these other risky retailers. The overall goal and the mission of all of these different research studies that I'm engaged in is to produce evidence necessary to then make more informed future alcohol-related policies, right? So this evidence is necessary so that policymakers can make more informed decisions about alcohol-related policies to come. And so when we think about the city of Philadelphia, you have to know your study area. And so the city of Philadelphia during the year 2010 had about 1.5 million residents. It's a very diverse city. There are 41% that are white non-Hispanic residents that reside in the city of Philadelphia, but 43.4% are African American. And then Hispanics make just shy of 13%. The median household income in the city of Philadelphia is around $37,000, which is lower than the state median of close to $51,000, but that's very similar for a lot of major cities across the US and how they compare to their state. Now, when we talk about the neighborhood dynamics of Philadelphia and how, in order for me to look at this relationship between alcohol and violence, I have to take a lot of things into consideration. I have to take into consideration public transit. I have to take into consideration income levels. I have to take into consideration vacant housing units, the age of the population, population density, Black female-headed households, because unfortunately, these are indicators that will allow us to really understand that relationship between alcohol and violence. What I was primarily interested in, though, was alcohol sales as a percent of median household income and commercial businesses. And then thirdly, these risky retailers. And the reason why the risky retailers are important is because when you think about what characterizes a neighborhood, if you have certain retailers that already attract certain types of behaviors, then that might contribute to the violence levels that might be present within that neighborhood. And so when you think about pawn shops and you think about the dynamics of pawn shops, unfortunately, there are a lot of dynamics in play and behaviors in play that lead individuals to go into pawn shops. And whether that is you are the buyer or you are the seller. And so I was really interested in trying to understand this relationship between alcohol and violence, but seeing if it still persisted after looking at these different relationships as well. So just to give you a little bit in terms of the findings, these two maps here show the spatial distribution, or basically the patterning of alcohol outlets on the left and violence on the right. And so the map of Philadelphia here, we have an arrow that basically shows you where Center City, Philadelphia, is pointed out. And the reason why is because you have a ton of alcohol outlets down there, but those are the alcohol outlets for on-premise consumption, right? And so when you think about all of the alcohol presence in the Center City, Philadelphia area, if what we think is true in terms of more alcohol outlets and more violence, that then you would see this positive relationship between the two. And so what you'll notice is that when you look at the map on the left in the Center City region, the Center City region does not necessarily have the largest amounts of violence, right? Although there are large amounts of alcohol availability. But then when you pan out into certain pockets of the city of Philadelphia, you may have regions like, say, in the north, in the northeast, where you have tiny pockets of alcohol availability, but then you have larger amounts of violence that may occur in those regions. And that's not by chance. And so what we found was that there was a strong and positive association between alcohol outlet density and violence. And that persisted even after controlling for how much people spend on alcohol and after controlling for the presence of these other risky retailers. And what this supports is the concept that off-premise alcohol outlets in the neighborhood environment, they may impact not only health, but social outcomes like violence. And then lastly, the positive outlet violence association in the face of these controls means it's not an association due solely to alcohol availability or to retail density. So that was the Philadelphia study. The Seattle, Washington study, I published these findings in 2016. And so this paper was entitled The Spatial Temporal Relationship Between Alcohol Outlets and Violence Before and After Privatization, a Natural Experiment. And the reason why it's called a natural experiment is because when privatization happened in Seattle, Washington, you could look at that relationship between alcohol and violence before privatization and then after privatization. And so that's why we're looking at the years 2010 to 2013. And so the aims of this study, it was very similar to the Philadelphia study, except now we include this temporal component, right? We're looking at this relationship over time, not just one snapshot in time, say in the year 2010, like what we did for the city of Philadelphia. So here we wanted to characterize and map the distribution of alcohol outlets and assaults in Seattle, Washington between those years, 2010 and 2013, and then quantify the spatial and spatial temporal relationship between these two things. Again, the overall goal here is to produce the evidence necessary to make more informed future alcohol-related policies. And so the city of Seattle is different from the city of Philadelphia, right? There is less diversity when you think about the ethnic distribution of this city. So it's predominantly white, so about 70% of the residents are white, about 14% are Asian, about 8% are African American, and about 7% are Hispanics. The median household income here is actually much higher than the state median. It's around $67,000, which was the opposite of what we saw in Philadelphia. And when we think about neighborhood characteristics, it's some of the same neighborhood characteristics, right? And so here, the only difference slightly is that we're looking at the presence of non-alcohol retailers overall. So this includes, you know, those pawn shops, but also a J. Crew, right? And so when we look at some of our findings, we have a couple of figures here. So the first row relates to the number of, or the mean number of aggravated assaults and non-aggravated assaults in the city of Seattle between the years 2010 and 2013. And we see an increase, especially when you start looking at 2010, 11, and 12 for the aggravated assaults, and then it somewhat plateaus. But then for the simple assaults, there's a sharp increase from 2010 to 2011, and then slow increases after that. The bottom row relates to off-premise and on-premise outlets. So remember, 2010 and 2011 were pretty much the before privatization era, right? But then 2012 and 2013, that's when privatization was legal, and or when I say legal, that's when privatization was prevalent now within Seattle and also the entire state of Washington. So that's why we see this stark increase. And the map that you have here on the right is a map of Seattle, Washington, and it presents all of the little census block groups that show the relative risk for aggravated assault during this entire period. The darker the shade, the more you have increased risk of aggravated assaults. So there are pockets of the city of Seattle, say in the southern central portion of the city, where you see these clusters of darker shades. And then also in the north, going towards the west of the city of Seattle, you see also darker shades. These pockets are showing this increased risk of aggravated assault after you control for these other neighborhood characteristics. And so what we found in this study was that there was a positive relationship, similar to what we saw in Philadelphia, between off-premise and on-premise outlets. So what this positive relationship meant was that, for instance, for every one additional beer distributor, right, there is an associated significant increase of 8% in aggravated assaults within a given census block group. Now, you may see 8% and think that that's actually a small number, but when you think about the number of people that live within a particular census block group, there are a large number of individuals. So 8% of that population could result in a large number of individuals. Census block groups that had more commercial units and also higher percentages of, say, vacant housing units tend to have more aggravated assaults. And then that was for the aggravated assaults. For the simple assaults, we also saw a positive relationship, right? So even though these are the less serious crimes, these don't include a weapon, we still see this positive relationship for off-premise and on-premise. And then we also found that those census block groups that had more commercial units, higher percentage of vacant housing units, more diversity, higher percentages of households that were living in poverty, and then more access to public transportation, they tended to have more of these simple assaults. Now, the most important question remains, what do we do with this information? So the now what section of my presentations often speak to that, right? So for these particular studies, future alcohol related policies with respect to licensing, they need to consider various health and social disparity measures at the neighborhood level. So not only do we think about the geographic landscape, meaning, well, can we actually put an alcohol outlet on this particular corner? But we need to look at the entire neighborhood structure, right? Does the neighborhood already have a significant amount of vacant housing units? Does the neighborhood already have a significant number of households where people are living in poverty? Is the neighborhood disproportionately of one racial or ethnic group? And the reason why these are important is because we want to make more holistic decisions in terms of where to put alcohol outlets and not disenfranchise neighborhoods that are already disenfranchised. And so in a very systematic way. And so decisions in other states considering privatization, so Pennsylvania, they need to assess not only the individual level effects of alcohol availability. And when we say at the individual level, we're talking about usage or abuse of alcohol. But they need to also consider the neighborhood effects. And so neighborhood effects speak to the social related issues that alcohol could introduce. So alcohol and violence. And so I wanted to acknowledge a couple of things here. The research team for both of these papers, in some form or fashion, included two key individuals. One was Tony Grubasic, who used to be a professor at Drexel University, but now is at Arizona State University. And then Lance Ballister. Lance Ballister obtained his master's in biostatistics from Drexel a few years ago. And then much of this work was supported by a New Connections grant that I obtained from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which is a nonprofit organization. And then lastly, I want to thank the Philadelphia and Seattle police departments, because that's the only way I would have been able to assess these different types of relationships in Philadelphia and in Seattle. And then also the Pennsylvania and Washington State Liquor Control Boards, because they make this data freely available and in a format that is digestible for researchers to be able to answer these complex questions. I have all of the references here that I alluded to throughout the presentation. And if you have any questions whatsoever, if you want to talk more about some of this research or even some of the other research that I am engaged in, please do not hesitate to reach out to me. My email address is lonnie@drexel.edu. And I hope that you all have a great start to this new academic year. I hope that although COVID-19 has posed some structural issues for all of us, we welcome you to the school, and we look forward to interacting with all of you in various ways. Thank you.
Next up, we'll hear from Kenna Udeta.
Hi everyone, my name is Kenna Yadata. Thank you so much for having me here, and I'm here to talk about my depth experience, my reflections on it, and how it relates to the topic of violence. So let's get started. Like I said, my name is Kenna Yadata. I graduated in March of 2020 from Dornsife, from the CHIP department, and I'm also a Villanova University alum of class of 2018. I currently hold 2 temporary jobs as I'm in the midst of my job search. I'm a research assistant for the BAHI project, which stands for Bloomberg American Health Initiative, and it's a targeted food marketing project, and we're looking at the impact of celebrity influence on targeted food marketing with Dr. Shariki Kumanika. Additionally, I'm also a research assistant with the COVID in Context Working Group led by Dr. Sherelle Barber, Dr. Lonnie Tabb, and Dr. Irene Hedden to identify the impact of residential segregation on COVID-19 outcomes. So Dornsife has given me really concrete tools and skills that I will take into my professional career, such as networking with leaders in the field, technical skills that I've learned in and out of the classroom, and the importance of collaboration with professors and peers. So my depth experience was at the Center for Nonviolence and Social Justice. Through Drexel University and external funders, the Center for Nonviolence and Social Justice was founded in 2008. With the goal of shifting the conversation around violence from a criminal justice perspective to a trauma-informed public health perspective. So that's shifting the conversation away from the individual and more to systems levels. And Dr. Rich and Dr. Corbin, seen here on the right, are the co-directors of the center, and both have a medical background. Dr. Rich is actually a teacher here at Dornsife, and I highly recommend taking a course with him. He is the one on the far right. Some of their main projects are listed here. Their flagship program is called Healing Hurt People. It is an innovative, trauma-informed, hospital-based intervention designed to heal wounds of trauma in young victims of urban violence. CIPHER is another program that stands for Communities of Young People Healing, Experiencing, and Rebuilding. These last 2 projects or programs are the ones that I worked on through my depth experience. It's a community health worker peers, certified peer specialist training academy, and the culturally responsive healing practice program. Both are a mouthful, but the responsive healing practice program is a new program to the center as of last year. We will discuss both of those a little bit more in depth on the next slide. So for my depth experience, I applied to the center specifically to the Community Health Worker Peer Training Academy program. So some of my responsibilities included shadowing the Community Health Worker Peer Training Academy. It was for 18 to 30-year-olds who have experienced community violence. This academy combines traditional community health worker with certified peer specialist training. I learned a lot by spending time with the participants, getting to know them, their stories, as well as learning the ins and outs of implementing a community program. As a follow-up, and like I said, a new program, the Culturally Responsive Healing Practice Program was created to demonstrate various creative outlets for healing that were trauma-informed and culturally responsive. Activities during this 2-week program included storytelling, drumming, working out, glass blowing, and yoga. And that was a really great experience, as a lot of the participants in the training academy continued on to do the culturally responsive healing practice program. And we took them to various spots in Philly to explore these different art outlets. Through these experiences, I produced 2 deliverables, including a logistical handbook for the culturally responsive healing practice program to document the logistics for future use, and an assessment tool to identify the capacity of a workplace to be trauma-informed in the inclusion of their peer workforce. So that was created as a response to the training academy. As the participants were being trained with these unique set of skills, we wanted to make sure that the organizations that they would be joining to begin their careers were able to provide for them in a trauma-informed way. So through this experience, I was also able to network with some leaders in the field, including Dr. Rich and Dr. Corbin, as well as several other dedicated individuals in the field and within the community. Some of my major takeaways from my depth experience included working with community engaged research, realizing when the information I was working with was heavy and that I needed to take time to protect my mental health as well, being able to relate and communicate with the community. Health communication is very important, and particularly within the fields of public health and specifically within community health, health communication and being able to relate to the community is a very important skill. And lastly, considering the implications of your work can help you think steps ahead. And that relates back to the training academy, as I was talking about, training them in the skills that they're learning is important, but also thinking ahead about the types of organizations that they will be working at. My time at Dornsife has been filled with a lot of personal and academic growth, accompanied with a ton of network and collaboration opportunities that have expanded my professional connections. So here are some photos, just to recap my time at Dornsife. On the left, I was a part of SGO, and so it's a photo of me and a few other SGO members at last year's pinning ceremony. The second picture is me presenting my ILE. The third photo includes our monthly Black Girl Coffee Time meetings with Dr. Sherelle Barber. And the last one is couple peers and I at the SAFI conference, which was hosted at Dornsife last year, with Dr. Chandra Ford, who hopefully you will explore in your coursework, but she is among the few that developed the critical race theory. The last point I want to make is that we are going through some very difficult times, and all that is going on in our society today, from the advocacy for Black Lives Matter, the pandemic, and the immeasurable loss of life that we've been experiencing, particularly within the last year. It is important as new students, especially in the field of public health, that you take the time to care for yourself. So I asked a few of my friends who are alumni of Dornsife to share some nuggets of wisdom of how they protected their mental health and practiced self-care. Some of these reflections included seeking out social support, protecting your sleep and downtime, setting incremental goals and celebrating the small victories, to not be too hard on yourself because the chances are that other people are struggling with, similar material that you may not understand in class, and to figure out triggers for your major stressors and have healthy methods to prevent and manage them. There are a few more on this slide as well, and I'm gonna email this presentation to Caroline, and if you would like to read them or you'd like to have this presentation, feel free to reach out to her. And I hope everyone is excited for this new school year and does well. Thank you so much for having me, and good luck.
This slide highlights one of the recent Dornsife student experiences related to the topic of violence. During summer of 2020, a group of MPH students from various programs worked with a local community group to develop a measure for organizations seeking to address gun violence. This student group was able to examine key performance indicators that sites can utilize to determine effective strategies and activities.
The organizations listed here are examples of some other relevant organizations in Philadelphia that have either worked with our students in internship placements or who accept volunteers. Opportunities for academic placements may arise closer to spring, but students are encouraged to seek information about organizations that interest them.
Thank you so much for viewing the fifth and final module of the 2020 Public Health Immersion program. As a reminder, Dornsife students who complete all 5 online modules and attend at least one of the synchronous sessions are eligible to receive a certificate of completion by completing the relevant evaluations. We welcome your feedback. The rest of these modules can be found on the Immersion program website. Stay tuned for information about the upcoming live virtual sessions that will allow students to explore these topics within the context of community-level disparities. These 3 sessions are population-focused, with panelist faculty on Black health, immigrant health, and LGBT health. We look forward to hearing about your experiences with the Immersion program, at Dornsife broadly, and as you continue in a career in public health. Thanks so much.